Welcome to Unleashed at Work and Home, the show dedicated to helping veterinarians, vet techs, dog trainers, shelter and rescue workers, pet sitters, and all the other animal-crazy pet professionals manage their stress and find more joy. I'm your host, Colleen Pilar, and I'm thrilled you're here with us today. Make sure you hit the subscribe button on your favorite app so that you won't miss a single episode. This episode is brought to you by our free community, the Circle of Resilient and Thriving Pet Professionals. If you like the ideas shared here, then you're invited to continue the conversation with other lifelong learners in the community. You can find out more at colleenpilar.com. It's the perfect place for you to learn cool stuff, feel good, and take action to create the life you love. Come join us. My guest today is Marika Bell. She's an anthrozoologist and a CPDT dog trainer, and I'm so excited to talk to her. Hi, Marika.
Hi, Colleen. How are you?
I'm doing good. I'm so happy to have you here today because, of course, anthrozoologist, that's not that common. So could you tell us a little bit about how you came to be an anthrozoologist and a dog trainer? Like, what drove you in those directions?
Sure. So first of all, anthrozoologist is the study of the human and animal bond and the connections and interactions that humans and animals share. So that can range, it's a huge interdisciplinary area that can range from, studying animals in a lab setting, not the actual scientists who are studying the animals in the lab, but the study of animals in the lab setting, I suppose, if that makes sense. You're looking at animals in the homes. We have animals, that we eat and animals that we don't eat, and the study of that sort of dichotomy. So there's a lot of different ways that animals and humans interact in our lives that sometimes we don't even think about. And that's what anthrozoologists like to look at, is all of those little connections. So not necessarily just our pets or just our food, but all of the things. And I think it's become a really, it's definitely a growing area. And hopefully people will hear the word more and more, because I think it's a really important area to get people thinking about those connections.
It absolutely is an important thing. And it is a very broad field. It can go in so many different directions. What drew you toward the field?
I mean, everybody always says, oh, I was an animal person. I'll start at the beginning, as you have suggested, where I first had my first really strong connection with an animal that was a stuffed toy. I didn't have a lot of little pets growing up, but I always really gravitated towards animals when I had the opportunity. And my parents were throwing this big garage sale that was a community garage sale, because we had the biggest yard. And so everybody from the church, I think it was a church, came and put out, whatever they've had. And somebody brought one of these massive lions that they won at a fair, a circus fair. It's like, it was bigger than I was, right? And it was old. It was like, it didn't stand up anymore. It just, flumped over and just sort of, sat there. But I looked out my window in the morning as people were arriving, and this lion was arriving. And I just was like, oh yeah, that is mine. So I went down there and I told my mom that I really wanted that. She said, oh, well, if it's still here by the end of the day, because it was like $4, right? Which was this massive amount of money for me.
Yes.
Because I was like 4 years old. So my 4-year-old devious mind, I made sure the lion was placed sort of apart from a lot of the other things, and its price tag was in its ear. So I sat on the lion, covering up the price tag pretty much all day long. Nobody really could get me off the line. So of course it was there at the end of the day.
Of course it was.
Yes, of course it was. And my mom ended up paying 50 cents for it or something like that. And so I got it, and that was Barney. And I completely anthropomorphized Barney. If things have entities, then Barney was, my guardian and just my best friend for a very long time. And this connection with lions in particular grew more when I saw the movie, when I was about 8, probably. I saw the movie Born Free.
Mm-hmm.
And just this idea that you could work with or live with a big cat, like a real big cat, was amazing to me. And, the effort that Joy and George Adamson put into this lion, Elsa, to get her back to the wild was was really eye-opening, I suppose, even for an 8-year-old, that was even a problem, that could be a problem of animals in captivity. And so immediately I was like, okay, well, that's what I want to do. I want to work with big cats. Who works with big cats? So maybe I'll be a zookeeper. Maybe I'll be a circus lion tamer. Like, right. Again, this is my 8-year-old mind kind of figuring out what the heck I could do as an adult with a big cat. But I really knew I wanted to have some sort of relationship with big cats. So that was sort of my laser focus then. From then on was how I made that happen. So I, in high school, you don't really have many opportunities to do that sort of thing, but I took a lot of biology classes, and I kind of realized that I was going to need to go to university, which was never really a question for my family, but I needed to do something more than biology, I decided, because I feel like lots of people do biology. It's kind of a very basic area. And I was going to have to like push myself a little bit more and do zoology, because there was really no other options, right? It's like there's biology, there's zoology. Zoology is sort of pre-vet, pre-med stuff, which was not where I wanted to go at all. I didn't want to be a vet. I fainted at the sight of blood when I was younger. I still have fainting episodes occasionally, but somebody who wants to work with big cats, maybe that's not the best thing. But I didn't think about that far. But I was thinking what could give me a leg up, because lots of people want to work with animals. I had, that was pretty apparent, but it doesn't pay well usually. So I needed to do something a little above and beyond. So I thought zoology was a little harder, and I could maybe, that would be better on a resume. So I went with zoology, and I went to Washington State University initially. And I tried to take as many classes that seemed like interesting animal connection classes, but there was really nothing that really spoke to me in terms of what I really wanted to be doing, which was looking at that connection. There was a lot of behavior classes in regards to like bird migration and mating behaviors, and a lot of instinctual animal behavior. That's what those classes were. They were about that sort of thing. They weren't about why animals and humans interact. And there was nothing like that on any curriculum that I could see in any university. Not that I worked very hard at trying to find a university, because my parents were very insistent that I go to university, and I certainly had always planned to. We didn't really have a lot of money. So a state university was sort of where, and, I lived in Washington State. So I had a couple of options, and I was kind of lazy at the same time. So I knew I would get into WSU relatively easily. There was no requirement that I had to write a massive essay or anything, which I just didn't feel like doing at the end of high school. I was kind of burnt out. So I went to Wazoo fairly easily. But again, not a lot of classes that met what I was really looking for. I think one that was really interesting was wildlife nutrition. That was a really cool class with Charlie Robbins teaching that class. And I got to work with the bears that were at Wazoo. So that was my first big predator that I got to interact with. And it was one of these volunteer roles where, I want a few students who will come in super early, help me feed the bears, clean the cages, and, do the husbandry stuff that we need to do. And I was like, oh yes, hands up, jumping up and down. Let me help you with that. And I got picked, which was luck, I suppose, because I think he in some ways just pulled names out of a hat for that. But I was super into it. It was such a cool experience to work with the bears. And, he did care about the animals that he had in the bear facility there. He also had a lot of deer as a separate sort of thing, but he would never do experiments on the animals that were harmful to them. And I think that was, if that had been part of what was going on, I wouldn't have been able to be a part of that. But it was nutritional research. So he'd feed them like salmon or deer, not his deer, but roadkill deer that would be brought, and, look at their poo, basically. And it was a really interesting little side thing that I was allowed to do. And one day, the babies were born. So we first get to start in March, just as the bears are waking up. So they're still in hibernation typically. And the babies are generally born, and he would breed the bears, or allow them to breed. I guess you don't breed bears, but he would allow them to breed if, there was room in the facility, or if he needed the babies for some sort of research. And that was the part that was really, really difficult, because he did have to put some of the babies down afterwards because he couldn't find homes for them. So that was weird. And I didn't know that was going to happen when I first started, but that was a really, I don't know, sad aspect to the whole program. But one that I think we see a lot in animal work of euthanizing animals and animals as a commodity. So that was my first introduction to that aspect of animal welfare work as well. But it was amazing to see the mama bears and their babies in their dens and just, hear them. The mama bear would hum to the babies and as she was nursing them. And it was really very sweet. And I got to work with Bo, who was this massive, like 850-pound brown bear, grizzly bear. And he just was pissed all the time. Like, why are you guys here? What? I'm going to eat you. I'm going to eat you if you let me eat you. So just watch out. And we'd take we had these massive pressure hoses that we would spray down, the insides of the animal enclosures with. And there was a window that opened to the outside area. So you'd have to yell at the bears to get them to move to the outside area. And this was another really one of my firsts, was realizing that animals have different languages, not like you can't talk to them and say, in a human voice, I need you to move to there so that I can clean your area. And with bears, you have to talk to them in a bear voice for them to really respect and understand what you want. And you'd have to yell really loud. And I won't do it here because, everybody's listening, but you really had to scream, as forceful as you could, tell Bo to get out the damn door right now because you needed to clean his den. And he would look at you and he'd sort of like, all right. And then he'd leave if you yelled loud enough, but he would just not pay attention if you didn't. And he would wander out there and then you'd have to open the window and there was like this white box that he was not allowed to come into around the window area because the window, he could slam it shut on you. And, if your arms were outside the window had bars, but, he could grab you or pull you out or just slam the window on you, which would all be a bad thing. So the hose could kind of be out there, but generally you're supposed to try to stay behind the window while you're spraying out there. But he would get in front of the hose and like roll around and like let you give him a bit of a bath. And he loved that part. But occasionally, I remember one time he was just in a bad mood and I could see him shuffling towards me. And I was just like, Bo, don't you do it. Don't you come over here. And usually that would be enough. And they'd go, oh, fine. And they'd kind of go back to the farther corner. But he was like, no, I'm coming over there. And he just slammed that window so hard at me, but I could see it coming because, you look at the body language. And that's the funny thing about animals, I think, is that communication and that body language is so similar over, at least with mammals. And certainly I think with other animals as well, but it may be why I have such a fondness towards mammals more than birds and lizards and fish, is just because I feel like I know what they're, I can feel what they're planning. I feel what they're thinking. Just by looking at how they're acting and looking at that context. And it was just a really interesting experience. One day I came in to show my mom actually the bears because we were allowed to bring our family and everybody was there. And I was like, oh, why is everybody here? But apparently Bo had woken up with a sore in his mouth or he was basically bleeding from the mouth. And, how are you going to check his welfare? Because he's an 850-pound grizzly bear. So I immediately suited up in my jumpsuit and started helping out. And we darted him and put him out, which is a crazy job in itself. Like the lung power you need to dart an animal is not like the movies. Like you don't just go poof and, like the animal falls over. You have to have so much power to punch that dart through to get through the skin. And then it takes like 20 minutes for an animal to finally like start to feel sleepy and then to fall asleep. And then you rush in there and we had to winch him up onto a truck and drive this bear to the vet hospital at Wazoo, which was about a mile and a half away. And they had to like figure out how to get him, and they usually did horses. There's a big equine and farm kind of vet school there. And they got him up there and opened his mouth and realized he had a laceration on his tongue from a broken tooth. So they fixed him up and winched him back and brought him all the way back. And then we all got pictures with him while he was completely out, intubated still. And, we're waiting for him to wake up a little bit so that you could pull out the intubation tube, but not so awake that, he would also eat you at the same time.
It's a good balance to find.
Yeah. It's a balance. And, but I've got pictures of me like with my hand around this bear who looks completely dead. It's got like a blood pooling around his mouth and this tube hanging out. But it was a pretty awesome experience. And that just made me want to work with animals even more and realize that I would need luck and I would need all of the help I could get in order to get the kind of job I was looking for, which was, big cats.
I'm curious about your mom's experience that day. Like she's going with you to see the bears and all of a sudden you're suiting up and going in. Like,
yeah,
the mom part of me would be like, I don't think that's what I'm picking for my child.
Well, that same day we still had to, they were still sort of in the middle of cleaning, even though it wasn't my day to help because of what was going on. So I helped with that too. And the babies, they had to clean the den and they had to measure the babies. And so one of the moms was outside and they had the babies inside and she did not like that at all. She was slamming on the door, like thumping over and over while we like really quickly weighed the babies and, made sure they were healthy and then, got them all ready. And of course, took our pictures with the babies really quick because baby bears.
Yeah.
And my mom got her picture with the baby bear as well. So that's what my mom was doing. She was getting pictures of baby bears.
Probably better than seeing her daughter like trying to winch an 850-pound bear.
You'd have to ask her how she felt about that. I don't know. I think she thought it was pretty fascinating. She's always been a nature and animal person as well. But yeah, it was quite a first, introduction to working with wild animals.
So what came after the bears?
I still didn't quite know how I was going to get a zoo job and work with big cats. But then a man showed up with a black panther or a black leopard named Thunder to do a talk at the dorms that we were at. And he was from a big cat rescue up in Spokane. It was about an hour and a half-ish from Wazoo. And he ran a big cat training, like zookeeper training sort of program. Not accredited, but I got to work with big cats. So I called my dad and I was like, so I'm going to go do that now and not finish my zoology degree yet. So that was an interesting conversation. I ended up staying at Wazoo for 3 years. And then I went and did this zookeeper training program for another year and finished my zoology degree after that. But yeah, then that's how I first started working with big cats was at this sanctuary up in Spokane, which was an amazing, crazy, insane experience that probably I can't talk about in great detail or else I'll get sued. But there were crazy things that happened and amazing. I got to pet a tiger and I got to feed lions. And, I saw a couple of instances where people were attacked by big cats, which was also crazy. And yeah, it was an amazing experience that I don't know if I can recommend it, but I do recommend it.
Yeah. Some experiences in life are like that.
Yeah, I guess so.
It paid off for me, but I'm not sure I would tell someone else to do it.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, the learning.
But I did get to work with my big cats that I had always wanted to. And it only took me till I was, I was 20 at the time. So it was amazing. And I made some amazing friends and some of them were big cats. So yeah, it was awesome. But I also realized at that point that I just maybe wasn't into the zoo thing. The exhibition of animals was a little, there was something didn't feel right about it. And I was disturbed by the focus on the bureaucracy and the money and, I want to say kind of sleaziness that went along with some of it. I wouldn't call Woodland Park Zoo sleazy by any account, but it was, it had its bureaucracy. And the privately owned zoos can be a bit sleazy. And, the sanctuary where I worked took care of the animals so well, all the money really went to the animals. It's just that sometimes the people are damaged. And that is, that's a problem everywhere. I know, but it's a big problem when you're working with big cats.
Yeah.
And that's where a lot of the bad stories I have from that time came from, is just damaged people doing crazy things that they shouldn't be doing with big cats around.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just after Woodland Park Zoo, I just realized that zoos were not where I wanted to end up. It turns out, after spending my entire childhood thinking that's what I was going to want to do, and I really had to come up with something else. So, and I had really burnt out on that a little bit. So I took a break from animal stuff. I got married, and I started doing custom framing design, art framing, which was amazing. It was probably one of the best jobs I've ever had. It was so artistic. I wasn't the artist who had made the art, but I got to really showcase the art for people,
Mm-hmm.
and they got to hang it in their homes. And, even if I made a mistake, even if something went terribly wrong, which hardly ever happened, but even if it did, nobody died.
Yeah.
That was a good feeling.
Yes.
Even on the worst day, nobody died. And you can't say that when you work with animals. So it was a huge emotional relief for me for the 3 years that I did that. And after that, I was ready to sort of go back into working with animals again. And I wasn't really sure how I wanted to do that, because I had done the big cat stuff. I had done the zoos, and I didn't really know where else I wanted to go from there. So I took a course on dog training, because I had been introduced to clicker training when I was at the big cat sanctuary. That's primarily how we worked with the big cats. You can't force a big cat to do anything. Again, going back to how you've got to talk to animals the way they understand. You've got to know how they speak. And with cats, you can't yell at them.
Mm-hmm.
They will not respond the way a bear will. You have to sweet talk them a little bit with a big cat. You have to, do things on their terms. And clicker training was a really good way of interacting with them, that they could communicate and we could communicate with them what we were looking for in that, interaction. So while I wasn't a great clicker trainer at that point, I thought maybe I could become a better clicker trainer. And I decided to look up dog training programs, because I figured maybe I knew some of the other people I'd worked with at Sanctuary had gone the dog training route in a various ways. And I thought maybe that would be a good way to do it, because I was planning on getting a dog, my first dog as an adult. And I thought this would be good. I could train him, and I could figure out if I wanted to be a dog trainer and help other people. So I took a dog training certification through Animal Behavior College, which seemed like a good route to take. There are some other ones I probably recommend these days, because there's just more available now. But for, back then, which was now 15 years ago, I think maybe a little more than that, it was a really good option, because it was a long-term program. It introduced me to things like working, with another trainer in the area and seeing how she ran her classes. I had to do some hours working at an animal shelter and training the dogs at the animal shelter for part of the program, but beyond the book learning and the practicing stuff. And it was at that point I kind of got the animal welfare bug. I worked with dogs in the shelter and got to meet a few there, and realized that I really enjoyed that part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I finished that certification, and then we moved to Singapore from Seattle.
Just in time.
As you do.
Yeah.
So I couldn't run a business in Singapore, because it takes a lot of paperwork to do that sort of thing in Singapore. And so I didn't really continue with my dog training, teaching, I don't know what's the word I'm looking for here. Self-development in the dog training area, I suppose. For about a year, I kind of just, hung around Singapore and walked around and ate the food and did a lot of yoga. That was amazing about Singapore. There were yoga studios there that were open almost 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And you could just walk in, and there'd be like 4 different classes you might be able to join. Just yoga all the time.
Yoga all the time. I did not know that about Singapore.
Yeah. Oh, it was great. And foot massages.
I did know that.
Every corner you can get a foot massage. Oh my God. The best. Singapore food, Singapore foot massages, Singapore yoga. The zoos there were also very interesting. There's a night safari that is a zoo that's only open at night. And all the animals are there in the dark, which is interesting because, you see them more in the dark. They come out more because a lot of animals are nocturnal. And then their daytime zoo is also really interesting because honestly, there weren't a lot of cages. I mean, they had a polar bear. That was sad. Not a happy polar bear. But a lot of it was just like they put a fence around part of the jungle. And then just like if there were animals in it, great. So you'd be walking along and there'd be an orangutan hanging from a tree in front of you. And the orangutan habitat, like they had their own kind of island habitat, the way a lot of primate habitats are made these days in zoos, but they also had access to the trees. So much of the day they spent in the trees above you in a big part of the zoo. And you just look up and there'd be orangutans above you. You know, there was a lizard. I remember going, oh, there's a lizard here and it's big. Is this a zoo animal that has escaped, or is this just a regular lizard who just lives in Singapore? I don't know. I'll take a picture though, and I won't touch it. You know, there was that sort of thing. And that was kind of the amazing thing about the zoo in Singapore, I think, is just that it was like they didn't even need fences. You could just walk into the jungle and you'd see crazy, you know, animals that I was not used to. For them, I'm sure they were just like everyday stuff sometimes. Monitor lizards that were like 8 feet long just walking down the road. There was a snake one time, because, you know, I'm an animal person. I really gravitate towards animals. And that's what that means to me, being an animal person. And I was walking my dog, and who moved with us and our 3 cats to Singapore as well. And I was outside our apartment complex, middle of, you know, downtown city in Singapore. And there was this wall with ivy on it. And there was a little black snake on the wall. And me, not thinking at all, went over and went, "Ooh, aren't you beautiful?" And I was probably, I don't know, 8 inches away from the snake's face. And it sort of looked at me, and it was beautiful. I mean, it was the blackest black you've ever seen, with green, emerald green, and ruby red scales sort of flecked throughout. The most beautiful snake. And it was only about the size of my forearm. It wasn't a big snake. It was very thin. And it was just, you know, it looked at me and I looked at it, and then it sort of slithered up and away off this wall and was gone. And I didn't think about it. It was just so pretty. And I went home and tried to look it up, and it turns out it was a Southeast Asian spitting cobra. They spit venom into the eyes and face of the thing that they are either generally trying to defend themselves against, which is a neurotoxin, which stops your breathing and kills you within 5 minutes.
That would have been so great. Aren't you pretty? And then boom, that's the end of you.
Yeah. So I really realized at that point, you know, oh, well, I need to not stick my face into other animals' faces. And then you had a little panic attack while I sat there in front of the computer, realizing, what I had just done. And thankful that this little baby spitting cobra had decided to run instead of defend itself against me.
Indeed.
Yeah, indeed.
It's crazy.
So that was Singapore. Singapore was crazy. Yeah, I loved that part of Singapore, that you just, anywhere I go, you know, seeing the wildlife is just so exciting. Like, that's my favorite part of any travel, is getting to see the wildlife, even if it's just urban wildlife. You know, it's just as exciting as seeing, maybe not a lion, but other wildlife. And I think it made me appreciate also the wildlife that was native to the area I grew up, that I just didn't really appreciate when I was growing up, because, you know, to a Singaporean coming over here, I mean, seeing a moose would probably be amazing.
Yeah.
Like, how crazy would that be, seeing a moose, you know? And while I've never seen a moose in the wild, there's Northwest Trek here where you can kind of see moose sometimes, and buffalo, which are huge, you know, and you don't see those in Singapore. They would be very exotic.
It is true that we just kind of get used to what's here and are so surprised by what's elsewhere. I was thinking that when you were talking about just walking through the zoo in Singapore with their orangutans above, that for many of the people, that would just be like, well, you know, okay, there's an orangutan. But for those of us who don't see them often, it would be like, there's an orangutan right above my head. This is weird.
I know. Crazy. I know. So that was Singapore. But after about a year, we realized we weren't going to stay there for more than 2 years. So I started working on a business plan to start a dog training business in New Zealand.
In New Zealand?
Yes, in New Zealand. Because, you know, my husband is British, and he wasn't really ready to go back to England yet. And we weren't, there's something about his visa that he couldn't go back to the US yet either, because he had to be out of the US for a certain period of time. He really loved New Zealand, and he was like, let's go down to New Zealand. And I initially was thinking, this is even farther away than Singapore. And I don't want to go farther away. I'm already in Singapore. But he goes, well, let's just go down for, you know, a long weekend. I have to go down there for a business trip anyway, because he was traveling all over Asia and Australasia, and just come with me and see how you like it. And I fell in love with New Zealand. Just, Wellington was my town. I felt at home there, and, the wind will knock you down, and it's beautiful. It's like Dr. Seuss took all of his pictures straight from New Zealand. The wildlife there is primeval looking and amazing. And the plants are just like Dr. Seuss plants. So I was sold. I said, okay, let's move down to New Zealand, move to Wellington. And I worked on my business plan because he could get moved, but not generally to New Zealand. His job was actually going to be in Sydney in Australia, which is not close. It's closer than a lot of other things, but it's still like a 4-hour plane commute. So we were going to live in New Zealand, but he was going to work in Australia and commute when he needed to, but work out of New Zealand, because he traveled so much anyway at that point that it wouldn't really matter where we were actually living, we decided. So I started reading a whole lot more books, because I realized with my ABC certification was great. It gave me a really good introduction into dog training, but I didn't really feel prepared to take clients.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to the bookstore and I picked out whatever books I could find on dog training. And I didn't really know what I was looking for. I was just looking for books. I was at the Barnes & Noble in Singapore, and I picked up 3 books. And one book was, I should have grabbed them off the shelf so that I could remember all of their names. But there was one book about a woman who had such a strong bond with her dog that she was able to give up drinking. It was kind of a book about her relationship with her dog and how her dog sort of ended up being her focus. And maybe that wasn't the most healthy thing ever, but she was an alcoholic and she needed something to focus on. It was a really interesting relationship book about this woman and her dog.
Mm-hmm.
And then I picked up one of Cesar Millan's books.
Mm-hmm.
And I picked up a book called If Dogs' Prayers Were Answered, Bones Would Rain from the Sky by Suzanne Clothier. Again, I knew nothing about all 3 of them. They just looked like, okay, well, Cesar Millan has a show. I'll read what he has to say. I'll read Suzanne Clothier's book. Looked beautiful, and it was wrapped in plastic. So I wasn't even allowed to thumb through it. I just figured it must be good if it's wrapped in plastic.
Always the sign.
Yeah, always a good sign. So I took these 3 books home and I read the first one, and I read the Cesar Millan one, and I saved the Suzanne Clothier one for last because it was the biggest one. And the first one was interesting. Again, this relationship book. The second one was Cesar Millan. I tried some of the things with my dog because he had a lot of interesting things to say, and a lot of it made sense. So I did try some of the things, and my dog looked at me like I was insane.
Mm-hmm.
Like, just the look on his face was, what are you up to, lady? Like, you were acting weird. He was not a dog that, by any means, he was a very confident little dog. He would tell you what he wanted to do and what he didn't want to do, but it's not like he was, pushy or bossy or anything. And it was like all the Cesar Millan stuff was, you need to be the dominant personality in your relationship. And if you're not, then your dog is going to try to take over the world.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least your house.
Mm-hmm.
And while Cooper was never trying to take over the house that I could see, maybe he was, I was new to dog training. Like, maybe this was a thing and I just hadn't seen it because I just didn't know to look. So I tried some of these stuff. And again, it felt weird. I didn't do anything, super horrible to him. I tried claw hand on him. I don't know if that's something you're familiar with, Cesar Millan claw hand, to try to get him to stop a behavior that was annoying me. And he side-eyed me like, what the lady? Like, what are you doing? And the second time he just kept doing what he was doing. I'm like, okay, well, I don't know. I don't know what that was about. And the idea that I had to walk through a doorway before him, and when he didn't care, he honestly could give a crap who walked through a doorway first.
Right.
He didn't even really want to go out for a walk. Thanks. It's hot out there. It's Singapore. So, that stuff was sort of like, okay, take it or leave it. And then I read Suzanne's book, and it was like that ka-chunk sort of moment where I realized, oh, this is the relationship that I want to have.
Yes.
This feels right. This is the kind of dog trainer I want to be for people, to help them, have this sort of relationship with their dogs. And so I started picking up more books, and not, again, just trying to pick up everything I could find. I wasn't really focused on one particular style of training, because what I wanted to do was make sure that I knew what everybody was talking about. That way, if I did read, or if one of my clients was a real follower of Cesar Millan, I could talk to them about that, find out what they liked about it. And there's a lot of those books out there, not Cesar Millan necessarily, but lots of other authors that have maybe questionable methods that people had read. And it did actually really pay off. I had one client who had read a book that had told her that to get her Labradoodle to stop jumping up and, getting crazy when they got home, they had to ignore him. So they would ignore him for 3 hours because he would not calm down, right? Because he had a lot of energy and he was excited to see them. And so he had this trick of running into the son's room and grabbing some socks and then running around the house with them, because that would finally get their attention. Like they couldn't ignore that because he was going to eat these socks. And so they hired me because I had said I'd read this book on one of my blogs that she decided was the book they wanted to do everything by, even though it couldn't figure out why this method wasn't working.
Right.
So I talked to them about it, figured out what she liked about it, and what was going to work and what wasn't. And we realized that there were actually moments where the dog was being quiet. They were just very small, short moments. And she needed to figure out how to reinforce those moments instead of just ignoring him for 3 hours.
Right.
Like ignoring for 3 seconds and then finding that moment where he sits, finding that moment where his butt touches the ground, finding that moment where he looks away and goes and finds, a toy that you want him to do. That's the moment you want to reinforce. And whether that's with a clicker or a treat or just a good boy and a pat, great. Like I'm not married to the idea of using treats and clickers only. I think they're great communication devices and great rewards for when you want to, have those moments of training. But, if you don't want to use those, then find out what else your dog likes and do that. And I really, when I started taking clients in New Zealand, after I had read all of these books and started feeling a bit more confident, even just reading more books wasn't enough. I started volunteering with the animal shelters that were nearby, because again, I'd had this experience with ABC where I worked with Seattle Humane here. And I started just offering my dog training services to the shelters that were nearby and saying, I'll just come in as a regular volunteer if you want me to, but I could also train the dogs if you want me to. And they said, yeah, sure. I mean, in both cases, they were like, just train the dogs. We don't have anybody doing that right now. So that's great. So I would spend, 2 or 3 hours each time I went down, and I would go through all of the dogs. These are relatively small shelters. They were the RSPCA of New Zealand, but they just kind of let me do my thing. And I would practice my clicker work with their dogs, and I'd help them with a little bit of play group stuff. And we would talk about the dogs and their personalities and what would be good for them. And I didn't work with the puppies too much because they had a whole another section for puppies, but occasionally got to work with some puppies at the other shelter and do personality stuff with them. And I really was interested in finding out more about temperament testing and personality testing, how that really worked, or if it worked. How do you actually match these animals up with humans? That was so stressful to me to think about. Like, what if you get the wrong match? What if they don't like the dog, or the dog doesn't like them? Or I couldn't do it. I could work with the dogs. I could do the training, but that part blew my mind. Like, how do you make that decision, whether it's going to be a right choice or not? Because if you make the wrong choice, like maybe the dog or human is going to be unhappy for the rest of their life with that new companion. But for me, whenever I find something that I don't understand or don't feel comfortable with, I want to dig into it a bit more and figure out how to do it. So I started looking for books on that subject and looking for books on how to walk dogs, because, reactive dogs are such an issue at the moment, and have been for a while now, really. Maybe they always have been. But, working with dogs on leash versus just off leash, because I'd pretty much always done off leash stuff. And I just really honed my clicker skills during that time and worked with all of these shelter dogs, not really dogs in anybody's home, because I had to wait for my business license to come through before I could actually take clients in New Zealand. So I did that for quite a few months. And then when that finally came through, I got my business visa. I started taking clients, and I did that for 3 years in New Zealand, and I loved it. It was amazing going into people's homes and helping them work with issues. I kept pictures of all the dogs that I worked with, especially all the ones that had gone through the shelters, because I continued to volunteer at the shelter. And I would take pictures of the dogs at the shelter, and we'd use them on the website often. And then I'd end up working with those dogs in the new home that they were in also sometimes. So I really, really enjoyed that aspect of that work, because it's been, again, almost 15 years since all of that. And I feel like a lot of those dogs now are probably have passed away. Like, I don't know how many of those dogs that I worked with in New Zealand are still around, but I know the people I worked with, I think for a lot of them, it changed how they worked with any of their future dogs as well.
The whole ripple effect.
Yeah, aren't around anymore. The people are still hopefully having those really good relationships with their future dogs. And so that made me really happy. Still does.
You're a great storyteller. You have so many great stories. And I would let you go on forever, except for,
I know. We're just in New Zealand.
I know.
I can quickly say that after New Zealand, we went to Washington, D.C., and I was the director for behavior and rehoming at the Washington Humane Society for a couple of years. And again, lots of good stories there. Then we moved to the UK, and I started a animal sanctuary there. We also did hedgehog release and fostering for the wild hedgehogs that are in England. And we had sheep on the sanctuary. And I didn't do dog training anymore after that. That is where I ended up doing my anthrozoology degree with the University of Exeter, which is a fantastic anthrozoology program. Because when I left DC was an amazing, I loved working with the people there. The Washington Humane Society was amazing. I was really sad to leave that job, but I knew if I was going to, then I wanted to do my next school thing. So I looked around and anthrozoology was suddenly a thing. It was like, oh my gosh, this is what I've been looking for. Like, there is this thing, no matter what my teacher said that I was crazy, that nobody cares about whether animals and humans can interact. Like, they do care.
They do.
And they do. And there's now more than one place that focuses on it. There's human animal studies, there's anthrozoology, there's zooanthropology, there's, different terms or different words for the same term. And depending where you go, and the Exeter Anthrozoology program is excellent. I would highly recommend it. It's an online program. So, like 95% of it's online. And it was so great. It opened up my eyes to so many, again, the broadness of the area and stuff I hadn't even thought of before. So it just really got me excited about all of the different ways that humans and animals interact. And so, during the pandemic, I've been raising 2 small children now for a couple of years, and I needed to think about some things that weren't just about little kids. I love my little kids, but yeah, I needed some more things to think about. And so I decided to start a podcast. So I started an anthrozoology podcast, and now I get to talk to really interesting people all the time about a subject that is amazing and fascinating and really never-ending fascinating, because there's just so many different ways that we interact with animals.
Yes, there are. There's so many different ways. And podcasting is such a great way to do that, because that's why I'm so glad you're here with me. And one of the things we do on my show is talk about words that have had meaning to a person. And the words you shared were "this too shall pass." I'm never sure how you say it, from the desiderata. Is that how I've heard that said different ways, and I'm not sure what the proper pronunciation of that one is.
Desiderata is how I've always pronounced it. But yeah, you're right. I've heard it pronounced a couple of different ways.
Yeah. And I thought that was an interesting quote. And in listening to you tell your stories, now I'm like, oh, I think I know why that's meaningful to her, but I'm so curious to hear. Where did you pick that up along the way, and what has it meant to you?
It was something my mom said a lot when I was a kid, and I found the entire piece on some sort of, I think in the UK at some market, on a piece of parchment, and it's just so beautiful. And the idea that everything in life is fleeting, and you have to appreciate what you have when you have it, or you're just never going to be happy.
Yeah.
But also the things that are sad and horrifying and that really affect you negatively will also pass.
Yeah.
So when I was in Singapore, I caught so many colds. I caught everything. If you could be allergic to a country, I was allergic to Singapore. I just was sick all the time. And, I knew we were only going to be there 2 years. It's rough. The pandemic is rough for so many people in so many ways. Losing a pet is rough, which we just lost Cooper, the dog that traveled with us for 17 years last week. Sorry, don't want to cry. But it all passes,
It all passes.
Yeah. Things always eventually do get better, and then they get worse again. But they just keep going, and we just got to go with it.
Mm-hmm. And be up for it.
Yeah.
Be in the moment with what is there, which you demonstrated so beautifully with each of your stories of that, where something would shift and you dove in with curiosity and enthusiasm and abandon and just sort of like, wow, what's here for me now? Instead of letting the time elapse and then be like, well, what came from that?
I had my moments of letting the time lapse, but it would always sort of, the realization would set in that I felt like I just wasn't doing enough. I like to be busy.
Awesome. So fascinating. So you are busy. And if people wanted to learn more about you and your work and all of the busy things you do, how could they do that?
Well, they can listen to my podcast. It is The Deal with Animals, and you can find it pretty much anywhere you can get podcasts these days. And you can go to my website at thedealwithanimals.com or my Twitter handle at TDWA podcast, or of course, Facebook, The Deal with Animals. If you want to, listen to me talk with other people about their interconnections and bonds with animals. And I like to talk to academics and advocates for animals, but I also love to talk to, historians and enthusiasts and just about anybody with a connection with animals, because it's not just a research area. It's also just how we live.
Yeah. And everybody has an experience that's interesting and worth hearing. And there's so many connections.
Yeah.
Well, I'm so grateful to you for taking time today and sharing all those stories. I have so many very vivid images from the stories you shared that I know will stay with me, not the least of which is the snake.
Don't stick your face. I think we can wrap this up by saying, don't stick your face in other animals' faces. Like, if there's one rule to live by.
Pretty good rule to live by. I think we'll adopt that one.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Marika.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Unleashed at Work and Home. I invite you to come learn more at colleenpilar.com, where you can be steady, be strong, and be long.